Hey guys, just sitting in the RV today, dreaming traveling. Today we're going to be reading The Skeleton Tree, Chapter 12, My Father's Ghost. It's getting good. Hang in there. We're almost to the end. Thanks for watching.
A glint of light shines from the water. Again for a moment, I'm sure people have come to save us. But it's only the tip of a wave catching the sun, a flash that's there, then gone. Suddenly a loneliness fills me up from inside. I'm not sure if it comes from the empty sea or only from my memories. It makes me sad to remember that night, when Thursday flew from the cabin. Driven away by Frank, abandoned by me, he must have felt betrayed. I should have gone looking for him, but I was too scared of the bear to go out in the forest. I couldn't forget the touch of its nose, the hot smell of its breath, the sound of its teeth snapping together. I didn't leave the fire all night. I remember how I sat there, staring into the flames as I tried to sort out what happened. I kept wondering why Thursday had left me at the Reepicheep, just to fly to the cabin to attack Frank. That made no sense, although Frank had the cuts on his neck to prove it. But I thought there was another, better explanation. Maybe the raven had gone for help. What if he was only trying to make Frank get up from the bed to follow him back to the Reepicheep, and no one would listen to him? Poor Thursday. What I wouldn't give right now to hear the whistle of his flight, to see him gliding across the meadow towards me. I love the way his wings flare at their tips as he stops in midair. I want him to stand beside me and speak his funny little words again. Beside me, Frank is holding out his hand impatiently. He snaps his fingers. "Come on," he says, as though he's said it 100 times already. "Give me the book. I'll read it aloud." I pass him K-Till the Raven Hunter. His finger slips in beside mine as though he means to keep my place. But he only takes a glance at the page, then shuffles through the book to find the point where he had stopped reading. Then he wiggles into his chair and begins. K-Till sat on a stone in the high meadow and sharpened the barbs his ravens wore. The final battle was coming soon. He could smell it in the air, like the scent of smoke from a fire he could not see. Frank turns the page and keeps reading. His voice becomes a droning sound as my mind drifts back to the cabin. That night, when Frank was sick, I fell asleep thinking of grizzly bears. But I was woken by my father. I heard his voice calling to me from very far away, and when I opened my eyes, I could still hear a distant echo. From shimmering coals in the fire circle, gray smoke twisted towards the ceiling. My father appeared inside it, like a shadow without shape, as though I was seeing him through a pebbled glass. He wore clothes as ragged as scraps of cloth that hung from the skeleton tree. It was not the same thing at all as the night his ghost had come to the house. To see him looming gray and gauzy in the smoke made me afraid. When he talked, his voice was like Thursday's, a sound not quite human. "Christopher!" The red glow of the coals lit him up in patches as the smoke gusted around him. "Watch for a man," he told me. Frank was asleep on the bed, the dark hump of his body covered by cloth and plastic. "A man," said my father. A groan came from his ghost, his spirit, whatever it was. "A man will arrive." He faded away, then slowly reappeared, holding his hand towards me. "7 days later, you'll be saved." His body grew thin and transparent, wavering in the whirls of heat. "Dad!" I got up from the floor, trying to take his hand in mine, but it became a plume of smoke that whirled away and disappeared. And that was how I woke, standing by the fire with my hands held in the smoke. The window was utterly black. It wasn't even close to morning. Frank was staring at me from the bed. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I saw my dad," I told him. "I saw him in the smoke. He was right here." Frank looked suddenly afraid, as though he was the one who had seen the ghost. He shook his head and told me, "You were dreaming. I saw you get up." "But it was so real." I rubbed my arms. They were cold. "He told me to watch for a man. He said a man will arrive, and 7 days later we will be saved." "If a man arrives, we'll be saved right then," said Frank. "Why wait 7 days?" I had no answer for that. I wondered if I really had only been dreaming. "Smoke looks weird sometimes," said Frank. "It kind of steals your mind." Uncle Jack told me the same thing, and it was clear that Frank didn't want to talk anymore about ghosts. He just sat there staring, looking pale and small, but I knew what I'd seen. I didn't understand it, but I believed that my father had actually come to the cabin in one form or another. It was an idea that scared me as much as it gave me hope. "I'm cold," said Frank. He asked me to build a big fire, and soon the cabin was sweltering hot, but he couldn't stop shivering. His teeth chattered in quick bursts as loud as woodpeckers tapping. I spread my poncho on top of him, the space blanket too, and all the plastic sheets we had gathered from the beach, but still he shivered, his whole body shaking. I took a stone from the fire circle and tucked it against his body. Frank was hotter than the stone. I didn't hear the raven come to the window. I looked up and there he was, his head and shoulders poking through the plastic, the rest of him still outside. He kept turning his head, watching me as I picked up another stone and put it in place. For a long time he peered at Frank, so intently that it scared me. Somehow Frank sensed the raven was there. He turned his head towards the window, then raised his hands in fright. They tangled in the plastic blankets as though his arms had become wings. "No!" he cried. "No!" Frank made me pile on the fire so high and hot that it scorched the salmon hung above it. He kept his jacket on and wrapped himself up in the foam mattress, but still shivered. Thursday woke me up in the night. I heard his shout and saw his head thrust through the plastic window. He looked down at me, across at Frank, but would not come inside. I didn't even try to tempt him. Drenched with sweat, I could hardly breathe from the heat. The fire roared and sparks flew everywhere. They had melted holes in the plastic roof. They had made deep craters in the foam mattress. Frank lay sprawled across the bed, and an awful smell filled the cabin. I thought the fish had gone rotten again. It was that same sort of stink, of maggots and dead flesh. I got up to look. Frank was asleep and he looked awful. The firelight on his pale face gave him the same unnaturally rosy glow that I had seen painted on the face of my dead father. He had taken off the black glove. It lay on his chest like a severed hand, still holding its shape. Thursday watched me from the window, only his head inside the cabin. I kicked the fire apart to make it smaller, then broke off a few pieces of salmon. They were dry and hard, as red as lipstick. There was nothing wrong with the fish. I gave a chunk to Thursday, who gobbled it down on the windowsill. Frank moaned. He rolled over, his arms flopping, and I saw his injured hand. I nearly screamed. It was puffy like an old mushroom. Streaks of red ran up his wrists and along his arm, and the torn flesh around the raven's wounds was black like old meat. Frank's hand was rotting. I stood over him for a moment and watched him sleep. His eyelids twitched, and I could see the white slits of his eyeballs. As my mother would have done for me, I reached down to feel his forehead. He came awake. Startled to see me looming above him, he flinched, and the black glove tumbled from his chest. That awful rotten hand swung up to push me away. We looked at each other, and then Frank tried to frantically hide that hand inside of his jacket. But he knew I'd seen it, and now he brought it out again and held it up. His face was always so much like a mask, showing his fear and disgust. "Oh, Chris, I'm scared," he said. Well, of course he was scared, but I could hardly imagine the courage it took Frank to say he was scared. It was probably the first time in his life he had told anyone that. I felt that I had seen the inside of him. "It hurts so bad." He sat up on the edge of the bed, that awful thing lying in his lap. "It's like being stabbed with a hot knife, but it never stops." I sat beside him. I put my arm around his shoulder. I thought he might push me away. I was ready for that, but he didn't. He leaned against me, not quite crying, but very close. "I'm so cold," he said. Thursday shrieked. His wings drummed on the plastic as I held Frank tighter. The bird made a terrible racket. "He's jealous," I said. Then Frank pulled away, and we both were a bit embarrassed. But the raven fell quiet. He looked at Frank in a curious way, with his round eyes fluttering. Death and ravens go together. I remembered Frank telling me that, and I wondered if it was true. A moment later, Thursday slipped out the window and flew away. I brought a water for Frank. I took stones from the fire circle and tucked them around him. His skin felt hotter than the stones, but he was still shivering and talking of the cold. Greasy with sweat, he twisted and turned. Around dawn, he fell asleep so suddenly that I thought he had died. I couldn't see him breathing. I had to press my hand on his chest to feel his heart, a fluttery thing as quick as the raven's. His eyes were half open. I was surprised by their color, as brown as the deepest water in the fishing pool. My father's eyes had been like that, so dark they were nearly black. As I stared, Frank turned his head a little, and I felt shocked as our eyes met. It seemed that we linked together, that I could see right through his eyes and into his thoughts, and that he could do the same with me. I felt his fear, his loneliness, and pulled myself away. Through the plastic blankets, Frank's hot fingers squeezed my wrist. He tried to draw me down towards him, but I couldn't bear to look into his eyes again. "I'll get you water," I said, standing up. His hands flopped back into the mattress. I held a bottle to his lips, but the water only spilled away. I tore a piece of foam from the corner of the mattress and soaked it like a sponge. When I dabbed it at his lips, Frank sucked like a child, his lips curling greedily over the foam. All morning I sat with him, nearly faint from the heat as the fire raged. Remembering how my mother and father had looked after me when I was sick, I dabbed water on Frank's face and neck. I brushed his hair from his eyes. He's going to die. I didn't want to think about that, but I couldn't stop. What would I do if that happened? I imagined Frank lying stiff and cold, just a shell that used to be a boy. I pictured myself dragging him down the trail to the skeleton tree in the darkness, trying to lift him somehow into the branches, and there he would lie, day after day, month after month. I was not afraid for myself. I just didn't want his life to end. That was why I started crying, why I lay down beside him. He was dying, and there was nothing I could do to save him. What a mess I'd made of things, I thought. If I had been more of a help, we might have made a raft and sailed away. We might have made a signal that an airplane could have seen. If I hadn't tamed the raven, Frank would not have been wounded and infected, and I couldn't even feed him. There was still sedge and seaweed and barnacles, but I could spend all day gathering that sort of thing, and it would barely keep us alive. I had gone for fish and come back with nothing, with less than nothing. The gaff and the knife now lay in the wreck of the Reepicheep, abandoned in my fear. I knew I had to go back and get them, even if the bear was waiting for me, but there was something else. I had to do it for Frank. Something even worse than that. I had to climb the mountain. I went right then, before I could change my mind. I drawn the fire and stamped out the coals. I would have to use the last match to start a new fire, but I was terrified of the thought of Frank burning up in the cabin. I took the roll of orange caution tape that I had found long ago, closed the door firmly behind me, and walked north in my ragged poncho. With every step I thought about the bear, and the closer I got to the Reepicheep, the harder it was to keep going. When I reached the wreck, I found it torn apart. It looked like one of the skeletons in its coffin, a giant wooden rib cage surrounded by scattered bones. More than half the planks had been pulled away, and they lay splintered on the beach. Inside, below a pile of broken timbers, I found the gaff and the knife. I grabbed them and hurried away. Past the boulders, around the point, all the way to the waterfall. I kept turning my head. I knew the bear was somewhere around me, and I wondered if there was a man as well. The man my father told me to watch for. I heard the slithering of little crabs scuttling away in front of me, and thought it was strange that I couldn't frighten them just as much as the bear frightened me. I wished that I too could hide under a rock if the bear appeared. At the waterfall, a rainbow arced above the river. Dead salmon went tumbling past as I climbed past the grisly highway and trekked up to the river. Even the gulls had moved on, chasing the salmon upstream. I could hear them squawking and screaming in the distance. As I reached the first bend, I saw a wolf. It was long-legged and thin, splashing across the river like a dog on skinny stilts. It climbed the bank and shook itself, spraying a silver mist. I felt no fear, although I knew it was utterly wild. It glanced back over its shoulder, then disappeared among the trees. Straight ahead the mountain filled half the sky. The fresh snow had melted, but there was gleaming patches high on the slopes above the ragged divide of the forest and rock. For a while I just stood and stared at the jagged peak. Then I followed the wolf into the forest and started up the mountain. The sound of the river soon faded. My time in Alaska had made me slim and strong, with muscles I'd never had before. I used the gaff like a pirate's hook, swinging myself over fallen logs. Every 10 or 20 yards I stopped and tied a piece of the orange tape to a branch or bush. I wanted to make sure I could find my way back, but I kept seeing those words reeling out between my hands. Caution. Caution. I went nearly straight uphill, aiming for the summit whenever I saw it through the trees. When I came out of the forest, as high up in the mountain as trees could grow, I tied the last of my ribbon in a big bundle to a little dwarf of a tree. Then I started up a stony slope with my shadow sliding along beside me. It was short and chubby, and I laughed when I saw it. "Oh, hi, Alan," I said. "How's it going?" The thin air left me breathless. The height made me dizzy. Soon I was panting for breath. I looked down over the river, over the forest and the ocean. I found the little grassy patch around the skeleton tree. My shadow Alan kept growing as we climbed together. The setting sun made him tall and thin. His skinny arms swung like sticks, but he was already fading away, turning paler all the time. The slope grew steeper. I heard a rumbling noise and looked up to see a cloud of dust rolling down the mountain. Dark-colored rocks bounded along inside it. As they crashed into the forest below me, a mass of crows burst from the trees. The dust cloud grew smoky, thin, as it drifted across the mountain. I climbed at an angle towards the ridge and found myself at a slope of loose shale. It was just like the place where I had struggled with Alan when I was 9 years old. I could almost see Uncle Jack and my father, and the straggling line of boys making their way across it. My shadow Alan was now an 80-foot giant sprawled on the shale. I raised my arms and so did he, his fingers zooming up across the rock to touch the very tip of the mountain. "Let's go," I told him, and stepped out onto the shale. Tiny stones skittered away underneath me. I started sliding, then fell forward as I reached out to catch myself. The shadows of my hands stretched to catch them. I heard my uncle's voice. "Stand up straight. Don't lean into the mountain." Using the gaff for a walking stick, I pushed myself up. Shadow Alan moved along ahead of me, as though leading the way to the summit. He grew so tall that he couldn't even fit on the mountain. I ate handfuls of snow, crushing them in my mouth, and then with the sun just a red line between the sea and the sky, I trudged up the ridge to the top of the mountain. I had expected to find a sharp little peak at the summit, but there was a flat spot instead, about the same size as the cabin floor, and I stood there for a while, feeling heroic. I could see for mile after mile all around. We were definitely not on an island. I sat to watch the sky turn black, hoping for lights to appear somewhere in the wilderness. I saw the stars come out, the Milky Way, Orion's belt. I remembered my father taking me outside to see a meteor shower and putting names to the brightest stars. "That's the Big Dipper up there, and that's Cassiopeia. That upside-down W." How old was I then? Maybe 3? Not more than 4. I remember being carried in his arms, bouncing along. They were happy then. They held hands, leaned against each other, laughed softly in the darkness. I felt safe then. I felt loved, and I wished I could go back to that time and make it last forever. The wind blew steadily on top of the mountain. With just a thin torn blanket around me, I shivered badly. I kept rubbing my arms, then stood up to stomp my feet. Below me everything was so black that I could close my eyes and it made no difference. I found the loneliest place in the world. I might as well have been standing on the moon. There was no one to help me, no one to save poor Frank. A satellite went gliding by. A shooting star burned its way towards Earth. The northern lights appeared, as pale as smoke. And then the moon came up, so huge and white that it drowned out the aurora. I watched it sail along through the hours as I waited for the sun to rise again. The sad face of the man in the moon staring down at me. I thought of my mother and father, of Alan and Uncle Jack. I thought of Frank lying alone in the cabin. Would he still be alive when I got back? I remembered him looking up at me as I left the cabin, and a little memory suddenly flashed in my mind of the very first time I'd seen him. His black hair flopping down, his mouth in a pout, his dark eyes smoldering. I tried to bring back that memory. Again his face flashed in my mind, and I felt myself sitting on the black upholstery of a big black car. It was not in the ropey, diesel-scented warmth of Puff's little cabin where I had first seen Frank. It was in a huge car, as it sat idling at a gate made of brick and iron, below enormous trees. I was sitting in the back with my mother, Uncle Jack was up in the front seat, and a man in a dark suit was driving. He'd stopped to let a yellow taxi turn in front of us. It came through the gate and went slowly past, and I saw a boy in the back seat staring out through the window. His dark hair fell over one eye, and he blew it aside with a puff of breath. That was Frank. It was Frank a bit younger, Frank in a suit and tie, but it was the same boy I had met many months later in Kodiak. Our lives had crossed for an instant at the gates to the cemetery, on the day of my father's funeral. Now alone on the mountain, I tried to figure out how that happened. At first it seemed a big coincidence, but suddenly everything fell into place. I leaned back my head and shouted like a wolf howling at the moon. In that moment, I knew the answer to almost every question that had bothered me since my first day in Alaska. It made me happy and sad and angry, and I folded down on the ground and started sobbing. High above me, the man in the moon went floating by. I could hardly wait to talk to Frank. I was excited and nervous too, and I started down the mountain as soon as I saw the sun. I followed the ridge and crossed the patch of snow, going faster all the time. I leapt along the line of my own footprints and bounded down the shale. A river of stone cascaded around me, and I rode it all the way to the trees. I felt as though my life had changed. On the long hill through the forest, I startled a deer. It burst from the bush with its white tail twitching and raced ahead of me. I followed it, weaving between the trees, bashing through the bushes, hurdling fallen logs. My strips of caution tape flashed beside me, here and there, and the deer and I ran together down the mountain. My imaginary world had come true. I was Robinson Crusoe, the castaway boy, hurtling through the forest on the heels of a deer. It veered to the side and down a steep gully, crashing through crackly bushes. I stopped to catch my breath and found that I had lost the way. Though I looked all around, I couldn't see any orange tape. I listened for the river, or for the surf along the shore, but the forest absorbed all sound. I couldn't see the sun or the shadow it cast. I couldn't tell east from west. I walked straight downhill, hoping to reach the ocean. Instead, I came across the trail of the grizzly bears. I felt icy cold as I stood in one of the ancient hollowed footprints and wondered what to do. I could keep blundering down the hill and hope for the best, or I could follow the trail to the river and know where I was. What if I met the bear from the river, or even another bigger bear? But what if I didn't follow the trail and got hopelessly lost? What if I had to spend a night among the bears and the wolves and whatever else there might be? What if Frank died because I was late getting back? I took the trail. It was the way Uncle Jack would have gone, the daredevil route. It was probably the way Frank would have gone in my place. But to walk down the grizzly highway was the most frightening thing I'd ever done. The air seemed to tingle with the nearness of bears, and I strained to hear the paddling of huge paws, the huffing of breath. When I heard seagulls crying faintly, I went faster. When I heard the waterfall, I started running. I had never been happier to see the ocean. I started calling for Thursday as I passed the Reepicheep, and when he didn't come to greet me, I feared something was wrong. But my worries melted away when I reached the cabin and heard his muttering voice. He was inside. Feeling happy and jealous at the same time, I stopped at the door to listen. I couldn't hear Frank, but Thursday made his lovely little raven sounds. A jolt shot through my heart. What if he changed friends, choosing Frank instead of me? I yanked the door wide open. On the bed, Frank was lying on his back. Thursday's black head shot up beside him, rising over his chest. Something green and black dangled from the raven's beak. With a cry of surprise, he dropped it, and his wings whistled open. It made my heart sink to see them so close together. Frank didn't even turn towards me. "Well, I'm back!" I shouted, stepping inside. Frank still didn't move, but Thursday shrieked at me to keep me away. His wings wide open, his little eyes ablaze. He looked like a demon. I felt sad and betrayed, so empty inside. I wanted to turn and run from the cabin, but then I saw Thursday's beak was stained with blood. "Frank?" "Frank?" I said. He still didn't move. "Frank?" I went right up to the bed. Thursday flapped his wings and cried frantically with human words. "Clever bird, clever bird." Frank looked more dead than asleep. His injured hand lay splayed on top of the bed, all red and torn. His wounds gaped open, tingled green around the edges, and stuffed with pus-like paste. Every awful thing I'd heard about ravens seemed true. The graveyard bird, the eater of corpses. There stood Thursday with Frank's blood smeared on his beak, that same green paste bubbling from his nostrils. "Get out of here!" I raised the gaff and rushed forward. "Get on! Get out!" I tried to hit him. I tried to kill him, but Thursday whirled around in midair and flew out through the door. I hurled the gaff after him. It went spinning into the trees, and little twigs came raining down in a sprinkle of needles. But already Thursday was far away. I had hoped he was gone forever. Angry and sad, I went back to the cabin and closed myself inside. I jammed sticks and wood in the window to make sure that Thursday could not come in. Then I sat on the bed to care for Frank. More than ever, I worried about him. He slept all day and he slept all night. Toward dawn, he started moaning. He tossed on the bed, kicking his legs as though trying to run. I sat beside him. "It's all right," I said. "It's okay." When I went out for more wood, I was surprised to see Thursday standing near the door. He was back in his old place where he'd waited in the early days, hoping I'd let him in. He looked up at me and made his little welcoming cry. "Go away," I told him. "I don't want you around here anymore. I don't like you." He blinked at me, looking so sad that I knew he understood. Then he lowered his head as though bowing, raised it again, and stepped backwards. On the ground by his feet was a watch. I could tell with a glance that it was the fanciest watch I had ever seen. Silver and gold, it had a dial nearly as big as a pancake. "Clever bird," said Thursday. He shuffled back another step and tipped his head again, inviting me to take the watch. It glistened in the morning light. More wary than he'd ever been, the raven kept his wings partially open, ready to fly away in a moment. His round eyes shifted from side to side. When I bent down, he hopped back, careful to stay out of reach. I picked up the watch, surprised to see the second hand moving. "Clever bird," said Thursday, in a desperate little voice. It made me sad that he was trying so hard to please me. I wanted to hold him again, to stroke his feathers, but in my mind was that image of him looming like a vulture over Frank. If I cared at all about Frank, I had to chase away Thursday. By the way he tipped his head, I could tell he knew what I was thinking. He forced out 3 words in a croaky voice. "Want some fish?" I remembered offering him a scrap of salmon with those same words, and Frank getting so angry about it. That was the first thing I had ever said to him. He rocked his head and muttered. Terrified I would send him away. He was trying as hard as he could to make friends again. I knew what that was like, all right. To have a friend one moment and not the next was horrible. He was no longer a wild animal. His only companions were people. He loved to be held, to have his feathers preened and tickled. All he wanted was to be loved. "Oh, Thursday," I said. But inside him was a tiny part that could never be tamed, and that made me afraid of him. I could never be sure what he was thinking, never know what he might do. I shouted, "Get away!" I swung my foot and tried to kick him, but he was already rising from the ground in a whirl of wind and feathers. I hated myself for driving him off, but I had no choice. "Go on! Get out of here!" I shouted. Inside I felt like crying. He didn't quite clear the bushes. In a panic he went crashing through their tops, turning in the air as he tucked his feet into a flying position. Then he merged into the shadows of the forest, and in a moment he was gone. For the rest of the day I sat with Frank. He seemed to teeter between life and death, and I tried to hold him on the side of the living. I told him stories, every little thing I could remember about Uncle Jack. In the evening the wind picked up. The trees whispered and groaned. Heavy drops of rain splattered on the roof. I thought automatically of Thursday. Then I remembered his mouth full of green strands, and I couldn't get it out of my mind that he had been eating Frank's flesh. Sometime in the night, Frank's fever broke. In the early morning he came awake, asking for water and food. When I brought him soup, he lifted his hand from under his jacket. I squinted and turned away, not wanting to see his wounds, but Frank said, "Hey, Chris, look at this." The long, livid streaks on his wrists had faded. The wounds still looked raw and sore, but they were healing now, their edges knitting together. Frank touched them, unbelieving, and his fingers came away coated with the green paste. "What the hell is that?" he asked. It looked like vomit, like mushrooms and moss. Frank wiped his fingers desperately on the mattress. He put on the glove again, hiding the wounds from himself and from me. He took the soup, and I moved away to stoke the fire. He smacked his lips as he ate. "How long have I been sleeping?" he asked. "At least 2 days," I said. "I'm not sure." Frank didn't say a word. Maybe he didn't believe me. "This isn't an island," I told him. "There's no one around. I stayed on the mountain all night to make sure." He slurped the soup. "I started thinking about things up there," I said. "I figured everything out, Frank. I know all about you now." "What do you mean?" he asked. "You're my cousin," I told him. "Uncle Jack's your dad." A little smile came to his face as he chewed on a chunk of fish. He swallowed. He wiped his lips. "You moron," he said, not unkindly. "I'm your brother."